Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to talk about Thomas Aquinas' 5 proofs of God's existence. This is a video that I wish had existed 2 or 3 years ago when I was looking into these proofs and trying to see if there were any adequate refutations of them. I'm going to go through looking at these proofs and responding to them basically and giving them a proper refutation. Let's get into it. The first argument for God's existence is the argument of the unmoved mover. So the summary that Wikipedia gives is, in this world we can see that things are changing. Whatever is changing must be changed by something else. If that which is changing is itself changed, then it too is being changed by something else. This chain cannot be infinitely long. So there must be something that causes change without itself changing. This everyone understands to be God. So, like a lot of these arguments, he basically puts God in this place of where the universe should belong, where existence itself should belong. He thinks that the argument here is that the question is how can some things change, or how can things change if everything must be changed by something before that, and that change must be caused by something before that, and that change must be caused by something before that. I think in his actual argument he uses the term motion, which I think is clearer than the way that Wikipedia has this argued. So I guess we can just replace the term change with motion. So like we see things move. Well, everything that moves must be caused by something else causing it to move. Well, then that thing must be moving as well, so that motion must be caused by something else in motion. So then you keep going backwards, and you realize that this chain cannot regress infinitely. There has to be a first motion. Now, how can we respond to this argument? Is there any implicit assumption in here that Thomas Aquinas is relying on? Well, he is assuming that the universe could not have began in motion. The universe could not have just began with things moving. And there seems to be no reason why this cannot be true. There's no reason why the universe couldn't have begun. I mean, saying the word begun seems is a little weird here, because it's weird to say that something begins, because that sort of implies a context of time. So it's weird to say that time begins, because it implies this broader context of time that time began inside of, which doesn't make a lot of sense, because time is time. There's no time outside of time. There's no before time for time to begin out of. So to say the word motion began is weird here, and I think this time analogy actually relates quite a bit to this argument of motion, because time simply is. There's no before time. There's no reason why time began, because time didn't begin. Time always has been. And when I say always has been, I mean for all of time, time has been. So there's no sort of before time. And this is related to motion, because time is literally a measurement of motion. So when time begins, so to speak, that's when motion begins as well. So there's no motion before that. There's no motion outside of motion. There's no motion outside of the motion in the universe. And that's sort of what God is in this context. God is sort of this being that starts time, that is outside of time, before time, and begins time. Well, that's fundamentally contradictory. There can't be something before time. And then the same thing with motion. There can't be a motion outside of motion. And then you can also always ask this question is, what moved God? I mean, like when in this context of motion, you can always ask this question of what came before that moved God. So you do need a prime mover. I get that doesn't actually respond to this argument, but that prime mover is existence itself. Existence began in motion. For all of existence, there has been motion. For all of time, there's been time. This is saying the same thing fundamentally, because time is a measure of motion. So for all of motion, for all the motion that's existed, there's been motion. So this motion, basically motion began. With the universe, when the universe started, motion started as well. It was same time, same thing, because there's no time before that. There's no motion before that. There's no motion apart from motion, and that's sort of what this principle or this being of God is supposed to represent: the motion outside of motion. But the thing here is existence is primary. time is primary here. Motion is primary here. Motion simply has always been. For all of time, motion has been, because time is a measurement of motion. So it's absurd to assume that there is a God apart from this that started motion, that there's a God apart from motion that began this motion. This is a very difficult principle to grasp, because we are sort of inclined to always think about time and motion in terms of time. We always see things moving in this context of time already existing. We see things beginning moving in this context of time. But the thing is, when time begins, when time starts, there's no time before that. Time simply began, and the motion began with the time. It simply is. This is a very complex principle to think about, and I would highly recommend, as much as I have disagreements with him, Charles Tu's video on existence. That's something I've gained a lot of value out of, and sort of integrating this principle of time with all these other things about reality. It's a very useful video, and it's a very useful principle to think about, because you're sort of, in saying that there's a before time, you're implying that there's nothing. There's a time, or there is a nothing time, which is weird to think about. There's because before there's time, there's nothing. There's no time, and you're sort of reifying that and saying that, oh, but this is still in a context of time. But the issue is you need to fundamentally realize that this time, there's no outside of this time. So yeah, I hope that makes sense. This is a sort of, these are difficult topics to formulate and talk about, but I mean, just think about this concept of time and motion and how they relate, and think about how you can't have there's no such thing as before time, and in the same context, there's no before motion. Motion has always been, and there's no like, you know, the whole Isaac Newton's argument, or the Isaac Newton's law, where there's motion can't begin without another. An object in motion always stays in motion unless another object acts on it, and an object at rest always stays at rest unless another object acts on it. Well, the universe, I mean, let's think about it this way. There could be two states to the beginning of the universe: in motion or not in motion, and there's no reason why it couldn't begin in motion, because there's no time before that. There's no reason why the universe couldn't have just begun with things moving. And that's sort of an implicit assumption in this argument by Aquinas here. So let's look at the second argument, the argument from first cause. This is a very similar argument here, but there's another fundamental problem with it that I want to get into. So the second argument is the argument from first cause. In the world, we see that things are caused. But it's not possible for something to be the cause of itself, because that would entail that it exists prior to itself, which is a contradiction. If that by which it is caused is itself caused, then it must too have a cause. But this cannot be an infinitely long chain, so there must be a cause which is not itself caused by anything further. This is what everyone understands to be God. So the issue here is that things are not caused. There's no reason. The existence of a certain thing is not something caused. You never see something coming into existence. That doesn't make sense. You see events caused by other events. Sure, actions are caused by their actions, but a thing itself is not caused. So this argument is really weak on that grounds, because there's no, like, a thing coming into existence is not caused. This is an arbitrary premise that's not based on anything. Like a rock coming into existence is not caused. The matter, the atoms, they're not caused by anything. That doesn't make any sense. The universe can't be caused. That means that there's something apart from existence. That means that implies in the argument that there's something apart from existence. But apart from existence is the non-existence. Nothing does not exist. And that's an important principle you have to keep in mind here. There's no apart from existence. There's no such thing as nothing that's apart from existence. Because if existence is caused by something, what is existence caused by? Non-existence? That doesn't make sense. Non-existence doesn't exist. It's nothing. So there can't be a cause apart from existence. There's no such thing as apart from existence. I mean, it's the same thing. It's the same thing with the motion argument. There's no motion apart from existence. All that exists in existence is the motion that's in existence. There's no apart from existence that this motion is caused by. So then you need to fundamentally, with the motion thing, understand that motion just has always been here. There's no before motion. There's no motion that caused the motion in the universe, that caused the motion in existence. And it's the same sort of argument here from first cause. You need to understand that there's no nothing outside of existence. So let us do these arguments now. These two arguments are actually probably the strongest arguments, because they fundamentally rely on bad assumptions about the universe. They rely on us viewing the universe in the context, or us viewing existence in the context of non-existence, which is like this infinite sort of void, which is not real. Nothing does not exist. So these rely on the premise that nothing is something that exists, that there's a nothing apart from the universe that causes the universe, or that sort of creates the universe, that is apart from the universe, and that there's a non-time outside of time that time arose out of, which doesn't make sense because there's no before time. So it's sort of applying these relational terms in relation to time, and these relational terms in the relation to the universe itself, the space in the universe. Basically, relational terms of time and space. It's applying them to time and space itself, which leads to obvious contradictions because there's no time outside of time. There's no space outside of space. Fundamentally, there's no non-existence outside of existence. That's simply nothing, and nothing doesn't exist. So, those two arguments I kind of group together in my mind. And then I group the third and the fifth argument together in my mind as well, because they're very similar arguments too. So the third argument is the argument from contingency. In the world, we see things that are possible to be and possible not to be. In other words, perishable things. But if everything were contingent being just possible not to be, this is basically necessary versus contingent, saying that things are this is basically saying that we see things that are contingent, possible to be and possible not to be. Perishable things, contingent things. He's like I don't like how Wikipedia is summarizing these arguments. But if everything were contingent and thus capable of going out of existence, then nothing would exist now. But things clearly do exist now. Therefore, there must be something that is imperishable, a necessary being. This everyone understands to be God. So fundamentally, I reject this premise that things are contingent. Things don't have to be the way they are. That is absurd. Things are what they are. Things have identity. And it's necessary that things follow their identity. There's no reason why a thing is contingent. That's absurd. There's no things that aren't necessarily the way that they are. Existence is necessarily the way that it is. I'm trying to think of good examples here, but everything in my room is man-made. So, man-made things are not contingent, or they are contingent on like man's mind and how he chooses to group things together. But things as such, like the atoms in the universe, they are what they are. They couldn't be any possible different way because A is A. It is a fundamental rejection of identity to say that things could be another way because we can imagine them that way. That's pure whim, and it's a purely whimsical rejection of identity. Things are what they are. They are the way they are in reality because they are that way. There's no outside explanation. To ask why they are that way is an invalid question because they are necessarily that way. They are necessarily the way that they are. Because A is A, because everything has an identity, and that's just the way it is. You can't ask why that is. That's a weird question, because it assumes that something said it that way. That there's something that said it that way. So you're sort of implying the existence of God in the very in the very question that you're asking. You're implying the existence of a consciousness setting identity in the very question. You're assuming that everything is basically a man-made thing, that we choose, that a consciousness chose how it ought to be. But there's no reason to assume that. There's no reason to say that a thing is this way because of some other reason. Identity is the primary here. Existence is the primary here. Everything is what it is because existence is primary, because existence is the way that it is, because existence exists. And apart from, like, there's no getting under that. There's no underlying reason why that things have a certain identity as opposed to another identity. There's no other identity that it could have. The thing has its identity. It couldn't have another identity. That's absurd. So, yeah, I think that refutes the argument from contingency. So now let's move on to the argument from degree. I mean, this is pure Platonism. This is probably the weakest argument, I think. We see that things in the world vary in degrees of goodness, truth, nobility. For example, well-drawn circles are better than poorly drawn ones. Healthy animals are better than sick animals. Moreover, some substances are better than others, since living things are better than non-living things. Animals are better than plants. In testimony of which no one would choose. I mean, like, just look at this. Like, living things are better than non-living things. Animals are better than plants. What is this better assumption? I mean, by what standard? You're applying values to metaphysics here, and that doesn't make sense apart from a consciousness. So, I mean, this argument's pure primacy of consciousness, in testimony of which no one would choose to lose their senses for the sake of having the longevity of a tree. What? But judging something as being more or less implies some standard against which is being judged. For example, a room is full of people of varying heights. At least one must be the tallest. Therefore, there is something which is best and most true and most being, which is, Aquinas adds the premise, that what is most in a genus is the cause of all else in that genus. From this he deduces that there exists some must good being that causes the goodness in all else, which everyone understands to be God. I mean, there's a lot. This is probably the weakest argument. This is probably Aquinas' weakest argument. This is a pure misunderstanding of concepts here, because we form concepts based on reality. We look at reality and we form this concept of, good is interesting because good relates to values. But let's start with concepts as such, because sort of what he's doing here is saying that we have this concept of good, and this concept must exist. This concept has to exist somewhere, which doesn't make much sense. There's these sort of perfect things that we compare imperfect things to. Well, there are these perfect things, there are these perfect abstract things, but they only exist in your consciousness. They only exist as a result of looking at things in reality, looking at a bunch of things in reality, and we integrate those things and we form a concept based on all of those things. We form a concept based on basically omitting the measurements of these things and making that concept sort of open-ended to imply all those things. And in that, we sort of form this idealized standard of what that thing is. And I mean, we do that for the definition of like any sort of concept. And then we can imply other concepts inside of that broader concept. So what we're comparing it to is not something that exists, so to speak. It's not something that is that is apart from us inside of reality. It's something that exists as a sort of relationship between our consciousness and reality. We form concepts out of reality, and we create this idealized version of that concept in our mind. That's sort of the image of what that concept is. And then we compare things to that. We see if it fits under that category. So for this example of goodness, I mean, like these premises are like, it's good by what standard? Like you can't say that things are better in and of themselves, apart from a consciousness. Like these relational things, these measurements of good and measurements of height, for example, like these are things that we do as a consciousness. Sure, they're true in reality, but they're true because of our requirements as a consciousness, as a conscious being. They're true because we have these sort of images in our mind of these concepts. We form these concepts about reality. And it's not as if goodness exists apart from us in reality as such, and there must be some ultimate good being that must be God. Like, that's absurd. And even his analogy of people of varying heights, one must be the tallest. I mean, like, this analogy doesn't imply, because there's no like ideal tall. There's no ideal tallness. Like, tall, saying that someone is the tallest is just a relational thing between length and ultimately height as well, like your distance from the ground. So you have this open-ended concept of height that you apply to these individual people, and you can say that one is the tallest because he has the highest quantity of length in the upward direction when you measure. So, I mean, all these things, I mean, he's sort of conflating concepts with reality. He's saying that we must have these sort of concepts in reality, and I mean, this is purely Platonic. It talks about Plato in here. It has Platonic influences, but he was not a Platonist because he didn't believe in the theory of forms. He argues that things only have a partial or flawed existence because they are not their own sources of existence, and so must rely on something else as their source of existence. That doesn't make sense. Things exist. You don't need something apart from existence for something to exist. That doesn't make sense. But that's something we've got into earlier as well. I mean, underlying all these things is this assumption that there's non-existence apart from existence that creates existence. But here's the thing: apart from existence, non-existence, nothing that doesn't exist. Non-existence does not exist. This is an important thing to keep in mind, because when you realize that, you can refute all these arguments very easily in your mind. Like, you can see how untrue these arguments are. So the fifth argument is the argument from final cause or end. So the summary is: we see various non-intelligent objects in the world behaving in regular ways. This cannot be due to chance, since then they would behave with predictable results, or not behave with predictable results. So their behavior must be set. But it cannot be set by themselves, since they are not intelligent and have no notion of how to set behavior. Therefore, their behavior must be set by something else, and by implication, something that must be intelligent. This everyone understands to be God. So I mean, this is basically just the argument of fine tuning. That there must be some being to set the regular behavior of things. No, beings have a certain identity. Entities have an identity. We observe this in reality. This is primary. Everything is what it is, and it has a certain identity and behaves according to that identity, just because that is how its identity interacts with reality and other things in reality. There's no need to explain why it has that certain identity and why that identity interacts with things in a certain way. It simply does. There's nothing apart from that. There's no need to explain that. And there's no chance that it could behave any other way, because it has that identity, because it has that nature. It has that these actions, these behaviors in its nature. And the question of what sets that nature is irrelevant. There's no reason why that nature has to be set by anything. It simply is that way. And there's no why. Like, it's absurd. Like, to ask, oh, why do electrons, or why are positive charges attracted to negative charges? I mean, they simply are. There's no need to explain why. It couldn't have been a different way. There's no other way that it could be. Things behave according to their identity, and that's the identity of these charges. These charges are attracted to these things. There's no need to explain this. And I think once you realize that things are what they are, once you fully integrate the idea of identity and existence, once you fully integrate the idea that existence exists, and that there's no non-existence, that there's nothing outside of existence, and the idea that A is A, everything is what it is, and it just has a nature. Everything acts according to its nature, and there's no asking why to these things. These things are simply axioms. we can look at reality and see that everything is something. Everything is something, and everything has a specific identity. That's sort of what that statement implies. Like, I observe, like, in every observation you see, I observe something. So that implies consciousness, of course, that you have a consciousness. But then it also implies existence, because you observe something, existence. You observe something in particular as well, which is an identity. And when you can integrate these things with reality, when you can integrate these things and understand what these things mean fully, that identity is not some contingent thing. Contingent on what? What does that even mean? An existent is necessarily what it is. There's no something being what it is not. That's absurd. There's nothing apart from identity. There's no reason why. There's nothing apart from existence. There's no reason why a certain thing has a certain identity. That doesn't make any sense. And once you can realize that existence is what it is and that there's nothing apart from existence, once you can understand that and fully integrate that fact, then you will see what's wrong with these arguments. So just think on these issues. Think on these issues of that there's nothing apart from existence. There's no need to explain why something is what it is. That things are necessarily what they are. That A is necessarily A. That every percept or every entity is necessarily what it is. Once you can integrate these things, you can see what is wrong with these arguments. You can sort of categorize the arguments into 3 different groups. You have these arguments, which assumes that there's existence apart from existence. You have the 3rd and 5th argument, which assumes that there is that identity is contingent, that things aren't necessarily what they are. And they have this, and then there's this 4th argument that assumes that concepts exist in reality apart from the mind. And none of these premises that Aquinas relies on are true. None of them. They're all misunderstandings of metaphysics. They're very easy things. They're very easy mistakes to make, because it's hard to think about like existence it's hard to think about nothing because we know nothing doesn't exist, but we sort of assume that implicitly that existence is infinite, that there's time stretches infinitely backwards, but that's not true. There must be a starting point, quote unquote. There must be a time when time simply began. There's nothing apart from existence, and that's the fundamental, like, primary when you think about these things. But yeah, that is exhausting stuff. That is some intense epistemology and intense metaphysics here. So I might not have formulated everything perfectly here, so be sure to comment below if I was unclear on something or made any sort of mistake in my argumentation, because with all these deep concepts, I'm sure I missaid something or I misquoted something but I think I mostly explained everything as it ought to be explained, and the fundamental principles of my argument are true and valid. I identified real things here. Real problems with these arguments, and go and think on them. Understand these things for yourself, and I think you'll realize that God does not exist, and that is a very, very, very important thing to realize when you're thinking about existence, and in the history of Western philosophy as well. God has played such a major role in a lot of the mistakes people have made. And these are the mistakes of Aquinas mostly. I mean, he does better than a lot of other rationalistic people when they're arguing for God, because he tries to be reasonable, he tries to be rational, but he fundamentally makes a lot of mistakes here with thinking about existence, because you have to deny certain things. You have to misinterpret certain things in existence to imply that there is a supernatural, that there is something apart from existence, and he makes a lot of those mistakes here. And they're mistakes that Aristotle didn't necessarily solve, and they're mistakes that we need Ayn Rand to solve. We need the greatest philosopher of all time to help us solve. And that's fundamentally what we can do with the power of the primacy of existence and Rand's theory of concepts. So yeah. Once again, one thing I should clarify, I'm still a student of this. I'm still learning these things. So I may have misspoke at some point in this video. I may have said things that are unclear. And I am learning. And the purpose of this video is to help myself formulate these arguments and formulate my understanding of Aquinas' arguments and how to respond to them. So if I made any mistakes, comment below. I'll clarify them, and we could possibly discuss these in the future. I'm open to discuss with anyone these sort of ideas, because I want to get better at expressing myself and explaining what I believe. So thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Peace.